So, in this lesson, we're going to discuss how to use thought models to build a relationship with ourselves. And we're not even going to dig into actually using the thought models, but more of a bird's eye view on how the models show us how our thoughts are affecting and even creating our lives. You know, if at first, when I came across the thought models, I kind of interpreted the process as a tool to use to help me feel better. Okay, so I can accept that thoughts are creating my feelings, and so I just need to create a new thought. And, at the very superficial level, that's a little bit of it. But actually, there's so much more to thought models. And when we understand not just how to use them, but why we're using them, they literally can transform our internal relationship with ourself, and build our self-confidence and build our self-esteem because we're becoming so much more aware of ourselves. So, the primary purpose of the thought model is for us to begin to see that we live inside of a story. And a lot of the components of that story seem to be preordained or pre written or not controllable. But when you can look at your life and realize that it's just a story you're telling yourself, then it's the crowbar into affecting change and to building the life that you want and to leveling up so that you're not just a victim of circumstance or a victim of your own emotions or a victim of other people's assholishness or decisions or whatever. We can always choose the way we see things. And we've heard stories of, the guy in prison who finally finds freedom, and he's become a Buddhist or a Zen master or a yogi. And he has his little square of a window where he looks out into the world, or he lives in complete darkness. And yet he's found a way to free his mind. And that is, evidence that you can take any circumstance and decide what it means and decide what your purpose is within inside of that story, and that we have a lot of power. But it's a lot harder to go into our privileged middle class lives and really have the same sense of agency over our circumstances. And yet, if an uneducated, victim of racism and plight, in a ghetto situation, if somebody like that can eventually become self-aware and enlightened inside of a jail, then certainly we can do the same in our own lives. Um, so when we're not aware that we're living inside of a story, then there's no clear line between the circumstance and our thought and our actions. So if you remember that the components of the thought models are the neutral circumstance, how we interpret that, which is our thought, how we feel because of that thought, and then the actions we do and don't take, and then the results we see in our lives, then all of that, the thought model should prove that whatever we're thinking, our result just proves that thought true. Okay. And so when you really bring intention and mindfulness into this and separate out the circumstance from the thought, from the feeling, then you allow yourself to create something different than what you might just initially see. So when there's no clear line between the circumstance and our thoughts and our feelings, we believe that our thoughts about what's happening represent what's actually happening. And then we think that our feelings are just the result of what's happening. And until we recognize that circumstances and thoughts and feelings are three separate phenomenon, we remain victims of our circumstances. So here's an example. The circumstance in this example is that it's 4:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And remember that when we do our circumstances, when we decide what they are, it's a neutral fact that could be held up in a court of law. Nobody would argue with it. It doesn't have a story attached to it. It's just a basic fact. So it's 4:20 p.m. Now, that's not usually what goes through our head. So here's with that circumstance, I want to give you a bunch of examples of thoughts that are running through people's mind. So one thought might be, I'm early. Another person, might be sitting and waiting for somebody else, and the thought is, she's always late. Another person might be experiencing, attempting to do a diet. And so that person thinks, I shouldn't be hungry yet. Another person who's aware of 4:20 might be thinking, everybody's getting high right now. I wish I was getting high right now. Another person might, be experiencing fatigue and think, it's too late to take a nap. Another person might be at work and be trying to get their shit done, and there's not enough time to get everything done before I leave. Okay. So those are all the thoughts that are possible. And it just depends on who you are and where you're at. But the circumstance itself is that it's 4:20 Eastern Standard Time. And depending on the thought you have about that fact, or depending on the thought you have, the feeling will come up in response to the thought, not the circumstance. So you don't have an emotional reaction to the fact that it's 4:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but you do have a thought, or an emotional reaction to the thought that, I'm early, she's late, I shouldn't be hungry, everybody else is high, it's too late to take a nap, there's not enough time to get everything done before I leave. So if you understand that everything is up and open to interpretation, then you'll understand the importance of figuring out whatever the circumstances and why it's so important to really dial into a neutral statement. So the first thing that's important is to realize that you can become aware of two different voices in your head. And I'm going to put up a little graphic so you don't think I'm talking about schizophrenia here. When we meditate, we become aware that we have thoughts, but that we are not our thoughts. And so we have two stick figures here, one just looking at the other, and the one on the right has the thought bubble above the head. And we know we're not our thoughts because we can observe our thoughts. And all of us have had experiences where we get caught up in a story and maybe somehow we find out that the story isn't true. So it gives us a glimpse into what our minds can do and create and how much power they have over our emotions when we can see that there's a story there, or when we can see that we're ruminating and going over and over circumstances, or actually what we're going over is just the thoughts. And so it's really helpful to see that we have the thoughts in our head, and then we have the ability to observe the thoughts in our head. There is who we are, and then there's the brain that's living inside the story. It's living inside the thought model. So there's the observer, and then there's the character. And understanding that there are two different perspectives here is the way to create a relationship with ourselves. And we know this. We know we can talk to ourselves, we can tell ourselves stuff. And that's what we're doing. We're having a conversation with ourselves. And it's this relationship with ourself that we have to heal first. Because when we observe our own thoughts, that's where we might notice that we're feeling maybe compassionate and empathetic, but more often, when we observe our own thoughts, we judge ourselves. We feel pity for, not being able to think our way out of it, or for being so petty, or we're frustrated with ourselves for ruminating on the same problem over and over, and we just can't break the thought cycle. We judge ourselves. We're embarrassed that we struggle with our emotions or with our stories, and that we can't just rise above it and instantly turn into the Buddha. We feel annoyed that we have to deal with this crap inside of our own head. I can't tell you how many times I've wished and literally, as my husband operates on brains, I've literally said, can you just give me a lobotomy? Because I feel like that would make everything easier if I didn't have to deal with my own mind, and in times where I've contemplated divorce, I know that I'm going to get custody of my own damn brain. And wherever I go, there I am. And so my relationship with myself is ultimately where I have to start before I work on relationships with my husband or with anybody else. Because when if you visualize that graphic, when we look at the human having a human experience and the thoughts and the stories and all of that, we have to be able to look and see the compassion. We have to have compassion, and we want to be able to have empathy. And so, this, before you ever use thought models as a tool to change your thoughts, the first thing you do is break open and separate, the circumstance and what's going on from your thoughts, and then have compassion for yourself because of the suffering that your thoughts are causing. Where do our thoughts come from? In the thought model, we can see that thoughts trigger feelings, and feelings trigger our actions or inactions, and that those actions then produce results. But where do our thoughts come from? They're not coming from our circumstances. And that's where we have to break open the process. We think that something has happened, and then we have a thought about it. But circumstances aren't triggering our thoughts. Not knowing this is why it's so easy to believe them. But in our thoughts, they're coming from our programming. They're coming from our cultural and social and family belief systems, that it's like the fish swimming through water that we can't see the water. um, it's just like that. So we have ingrained beliefs about ourselves as women, about our sexuality, about our roles and responsibilities to our family and in society, and what's expected of us. We also, where else do thoughts come from? They come from past experiences. So, we learn a lesson in some sort of situation, and then we just kind of think that's a law, and we apply it to everything. If you don't lock your car door, then your purse gets stolen. That's the sort of thing where if you don't stop to question something like that, then you just have this belief. And that's also, our thoughts come from past traumas. I don't care how good of a parent you are, or how good of a parent you had, or that you had, all of our life circumstances affect us differently. I've said a story in another module that one time my mother, I was singing in the bathroom, and my mother said, "Oh, will you please shut up?" And how that was kind of traumatic and really affected my ability to. I was really into singing and performing, and that affected my voice. Whereas my little sister, if my mom had said that to her, she would have laughed and sang louder. So it's still a trauma for me. But trauma isn't the external circumstance that happens to us, it's how we respond and react. And so that trauma then creates thoughts and subsequently feelings that then we carry into other circumstance and kind of create self-fulfilling prophecies. Another place that our thoughts come from that we don't give enough credit to is our brain chemistry. And when you are suffering with alcohol use disorder, or, post acute withdrawal syndrome from alcohol use disorder, depression, and the lack of feel good endorphins in your brain lends itself to negative thoughts. So, you just jump to conclusions that, if my husband walks in the door late, well, it's because he doesn't care that I made dinner. I just jump to that. And some of that is just pure brain chemistry and what we're dealing with. Um, and then, of course, our thoughts are also triggered and produced by our central nervous system. And if we have a lot of stress in our lives and we don't have the mental capacity to handle different things coming in, then, we get a flat tire, and suddenly, the universe is out to conspiring to ruin our day, and life isn't fair, and all of these thoughts that come up for us. So it's not just that they pop in randomly from the universe, but rather thoughts are, they develop with our language skills from an early age, and they just permeate our experience. And if we're not aware that we are not our thoughts, then again, we're a victim of circumstance. But once you understand that you are not your thoughts, and wherever they're coming from, they are legitimately affecting the way you feel, we can't gloss over our feelings. And I know for myself personally, this is often where I get caught up in using thought models, is that I have not processed my emotions. I think, okay, this thought is producing this feeling. So if I just think something else, this feeling will go away. And it doesn't work like that. It's very important. The feeling already exists, and the feeling is energy. So it's very important when you do feel some sort of negative emotion, anger, depression, frustration, loneliness, rejection, embarrassment, shame, when you do feel those things, to notice and allow them to be. And they do dissipate. But if you pretend, you get your thought models out and you just think, I don't want to feel ashamed, I want to feel proud, and this is what I need to think, that doesn't make the shame that has been produced from the old thoughts, it doesn't make it go away. And so we can't move forward with our thought models until we've really processed the emotion. And that's because sometimes when we're dealing with past traumas and deeply ingrained beliefs, we're not even conscious of the thoughts that are creating our feelings. In fact, the circumstance itself triggers an emotional response. And so, whatever thoughts are happening are completely bypassed. And you might know this, let's say something really, some sort of traumatic violence happened at some point, and the person who perpetrated that smelled a certain way. Then, in another perfectly safe circumstance, the person who was victimized smells that and immediately has this overwhelming response, a panic attack or some sort of, emotional reaction. And so it's very important to not bypass our feelings, because sometimes the thought we think is triggering it, it's actually much deeper than that. And it takes a lot of excavation, it takes a lot of work to dig deep when especially a circumstance triggers an automatic central nervous system response. That's why we have to take our feelings seriously, and we have to give time and reflection to the process, because whatever we may be feeling in a given moment may not actually have anything to do or much to do with the present circumstance and the thoughts and the story that we're currently in. And that's why it's so important to heal that relationship with ourselves. And as the observer, when we're looking at the human who's suffering with this story running through their head, that we have compassion and empathy, because we recognize that their feelings are so much more complicated than whatever circumstance might be in front of us. We might be upset about, our husband always leaves the peanut butter knife on the counter. And we're embarrassed at ourselves for being so trivial and being so upset about something seemingly so innocent. But when you sit with your feelings without trying to change them, and saying, okay, well, I'm just going to think that it's okay that my husband leaves a peanut butter knife, it's not even about the peanut butter knife. And we have to give ourselves space to feel our emotions with curiosity, to really ask what's coming up. And there's always, or often, there's layers and layers of thoughts, and many of them are subconscious. And processing our emotions requires us to go deeper and not focus on the circumstance and not believe the thought, but just to allow the feeling, which is energy, to dissipate. Not argue that somehow we should be feeling something different. Before you can think something different or feel something different, you have to accept what it is that you do feel and allow healing to take place. Share what this practice looks like because I'm just kind of getting there myself. So earlier today, I had a coaching appointment with my coach, and some things came up. And it was basically about my own fear of getting out of my comfort zone and meeting new people and trying new things. And some of that, how it connects in with my marriage and how I've kind of blamed my husband for some of my loneliness. And then, I'm a coach. I recognize that it's my own thoughts that are making me lonely, and the behaviors, the actions that I'm taking are, I think I'm lonely and I think I don't have any friends. And so, I can do a thought model on that and see darn good and well who's responsible. But as we sat with the feelings that come up for me, oh man, it was like, a clear glass of water with mud on the bottom. And the more he asked me to visualize and go inside myself and call up the name of the feeling I was feeling, oh man, I was getting physically, it just, I felt pinched and cinched, and I felt heat, and I felt all of these emotions. And it was coming close to the end of the call, and he said, how are you? And I said, well, I think I might have to cry when I get off the phone. He's like, good, go with that. Because I had to honor, I didn't want to just distract myself from the feelings I was experiencing. I didn't need the story anymore. He and I worked through logically new behaviors I can try and a new story I can tell myself, but I still had feelings that probably go back to my childhood about loneliness and fear of missing out and all of that. So after I hung up the phone, I was like, all right, if I need to cry, this energy that's stuck in my central nervous system, like I want to move it through. It's still there. If I can think about it and it's all coming up for me, then I'd like to release that. And so he gave me a meditative exercise, to visualize my heart and to say, I see you, disappointment, and I release you, or rejection, or whatever it is that's coming up. Well, after we get off the phone, I decided to sit with it. And ultimately, the tears kind of didn't come enough. To also be fair, I didn't want to run my makeup for the rest of the day. So I probably wasn't like, yeah, yeah, let's cry. And so as I sat with that, the tears weren't coming. Then I thought, what else could I do to move this energy through, to honor this energy? And suddenly I just started singing. I just I just thought sound, vibrations, singing always lifts my heart. And I tell you what, there's so many things you can do. When you have and you're noticing your and feeling your emotions, how do you feel them? You breathe, you can cry, you can dance, you can work out, you can go to yoga, you can take a walk outside, you can take a hot bath, all of these things. Well, today I chose singing. And the more I sang, like I started feeling better. My heart was just lifted, and I kind of visualized the voice when the voice was coming out of me. I visualized letting go of rejection and disappointment and loneliness, and I just kind of stayed with it. And then pretty soon I kind of lost track of what I was doing, and pretty soon I put on my music overhead and put on some of my favorite singers, and I just sang for like half an hour, and it was really cool. And so the purpose of all of this is for you to see that using the thought models is a great tool, but understanding the components of the thought model is really your most valuable resource. And the most important thing is for you to understand that whatever you're thinking is not the actual circumstance. That's your story. And whatever you're feeling is not, truth either. And it's actually separate from your thoughts. So the story you're telling yourself may have nothing to do with kind of what's buried, in your feelings that have been there for a long time. And that before you create new thoughts and new actions that'll create a new result, you have to give yourself space to feel. And when you do this, kind of with that outer awareness, watching yourself think and watching yourself feel, developing a relationship with yourself that is compassionate for the human that is you, going through the suffering that you're going through. I love to say, and I believe this, that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. So if you can visualize the watcher, the observer, the spirit, the connection to the divine, that voice in your head, and then the little human with the stories and the past and the dreams and the expectations, and you can just have compassion for the human side of you. That's when thought models really become powerful.